This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we're learning about The History Man by Malcolm Bradbury, with our guest, Joseph Williams. The History Man tells the story of Howard Kirk, a sociology professor at a modern campus university. Howard is a strident and radical political voice on campus, who dominates both his fellow lecturers and his students with his opinions, and he encourages sit-ins and protests for all manner of causes. Howard is also morally compromised. He has affairs with his female students while simultaneously bullying his male students, and his frequent lies destroy his colleagues' careers, even as they bring him success. Burgess calls The History Man a disturbing and accurate portrayal of campus life in the late 60s and early 70s. Malcolm Bradbury was born in 1932. He wrote 6 novels, of which The History Man is the most well known, having been adapted for the screen in 1981. He also wrote a novella, a collection of short stories, several well-respected books of literary criticism, and many scripts for television. He set up the famous MA in Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia, which launched the careers of Ian McEwan and Kazuo Ishiguro, among others. He was knighted for services to literature in 2000 and died the same year at the age of 68. Joseph Williams is finishing a PhD at the University of East Anglia, researching the creative, critical and educational work of Malcolm Bradbury, Lorna Sage, David Lodge, and the journal Critical Quarterly. He has taught at UEA and now teaches for the Workers' Educational Association, most recently a course on Ulysses. As a reviewer, he has written for Literary Review, The Times Literary Supplement, The Spectator, and Tribune. And in 2023 he was appointed reviews editor at Critical Quarterly. For all the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned, head to the description of this episode. I'm Graham Foster and I spoke to Joseph Williams about The History Man by Malcolm Bradbury in April 2024. I'm joined on the 99 Novels podcast by Joseph Williams, who is here to talk to us about The History Man by Malcolm Bradbury. Welcome, Joe, to the podcast.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. It's a great opportunity.
We like to start the podcast by getting you to tell us a little bit more about the book, which is The History Man. How would you describe the book to someone who hasn't read it?
So, The History Man is a comic campus novel about radical politics in the early 1970s. It was published in 1975. And the action is centered on a Machiavellian and quite malign sociology lecturer called Howard Kirk. And the action takes place over a couple of days at the start of term. And even though he's a lecturer in the university, he spends a lot of his time sort of having house parties with students and pursuing young women and so on. The book doesn't really have a plot, but it sort of follows him over these 2 days as he sort of simultaneously arranges for a right-wing or seemingly right-wing speaker to come and visit the campus, and also arranging the protest against that speaker. He hounds and bullies a small C conservative student and generally sort of is quite a malign presence in the university. It's quite a dense book. I think Burgess mentions that the dialogue runs on. So rather than breaking up the dialogue with line breaks, you get these sort of big paragraphs that some of them run on longer than a page. So it's quite a dense book when you open it. Bradbury also described it as quite a thingy book. It's a book about things, objects, surfaces. And it's told in the third person, but quite unusually, it's told in the present tense. So it begins, now is the start of term. And it's quite similar in this respect to Henry Green's novel Loving from 1945, which is all set, it's told in the third person and it's all outside the characters' heads. There's no free and direct discourse that brings you into the feelings and emotions of the characters, or there's nothing that says Howard was apprehensive as he opened the door. I mean, Howard Kirk wouldn't be apprehensive about anything, but we don't go into the characters' heads at any point. Some describe this technique as postmodern, but I mean, perhaps that's an accurate term, but it's more a case of he's trying to portray what life is like in the 70s, sort of commodities, things, objects, and ultimately Howard is a person who views people as objects. As a campus novel, it's a satire. Novels like The Secret History by Donna Tartt, we might think of as campus novels because they're set on a campus, but really the campus novel is a specific tradition of comic novel which sort of treats academics satirically. So the campus novel is never about the students, it's always about the faculty and what they get up to. But normally in the campus novel, so Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim is one well-known example from 1954, or David Lodge's Rummage trilogy, Changing Places, Small World, and Nice Work. They sort of portray the academics as sort of ineffectual and slightly silly and bumbling. Whereas what Bradbury does in The History Man is he presents a kind of quite villainous, malign person who's very good at getting his own way. So that's a sort of key change that Bradbury's making to this subgenre of the campus novel.
The way you describe it there, and actually when I first read it, certainly the opening scene about the start of term, it reminded me very much of White Noise by Don DeLillo. They're very different books in many ways, but certainly the personification of the faculty of a university, their philosophies on life, it's that sort of brand of campus novel I think we're talking about, and not the David Lodge's or Kingsley Amis's, as you have mentioned. It's a more freewheeling, philosophical take on a campus novel, I would say.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I mean, as we'll come on to, that Malcolm Bradbury saw the novel as a form of, he calls it a mode of inquiry. It's sort of intellectual inquiry, and in that way as critical as any non-fiction book. And even though David Lodge's campus novels do have ideas in them, and Nice Work is sort of a novel of ideas in the sense that the two characters have mouthpieces for different ideologies, Robin and the factory owner. In The History Man, it's almost like he's taken a theme, radical politics or liberalism in the earlier novels, and then he sort of explores different implications through the novel.
The History Man, I don't think it's controversial to say, but The History Man was a very, very famous novel in the late 70s and early 80s. And now in 2024, as we record this, it's not necessarily a go-to novel for people to read. So how did you discover the novel, and what did you first make of it when you read it?
Well, so my dad first recommended it to me because I was going on an open day to UEA when I was about 17, but I actually didn't get in that time. But then I subsequently got in for an MA. But Bradbury spent most of his career there, so he's sort of well associated with UEA. When my dad recommended him to me, I'd never heard of him. I didn't recognize his name. I didn't recognize his face when I Googled him. At first, I thought that was my fault, but actually, as you describe, he's basically criminally underread now. I mean, it's, if people have read a Malcolm Bradbury novel, they've probably read The History Man. But even then, it's not as widely read as it was. It was a real zeitgeist novel of the 70s and early 80s. Malcolm Bradbury died in 2068 when he died. And since then, there's been a couple of reissues of the novels. Picador did some maybe about 10 years ago. But after that, if you buy one, it's probably an Amazon print on demand. But hopefully, I mean, the 50-year anniversary might yield something in that respect. When I came to UEA for an MA, I wrote my MA thesis on Malcolm Bradbury's presentation of literary elites in the first three novels. So the History Man's 1975, but the two before that were Eating People is Wrong from 1959 and Stepping Westward from 1965. And luckily at UEA, we have a sort of archive of Malcolm Bradbury's papers. So I was sort of reading through his letters and teaching notes. And I was just struck from reading those three novels and from reading a lot of the correspondence that he was basically such a nice guy. He was just he was one of these people who's just really ebullient and fun. And it's no surprise that he wrote, even though the History Man's quite a cruel book, he was sort of always quite good fun. And I spoke to someone recently who was once sort of worked with him in the office, and she said he spoke to everybody the same, whether they were the cleaner or the vice chancellor. He was just the same with everybody. So I think it's quite a shame, really, that someone like that is not very well read anymore. It's not like he was a villain and he's been,
I think on the positive side, his survey books on the British novel and the American novel, the 20th century British and American novels, are still being read. I think they're still very relevant for people who want to know more about literature, whether in an academic setting or not. I think they're very easy to read books, and they tell you a lot about what was going on in 20th century literature generally. So I think he is still being read, but perhaps his novels are not quite as well recognized as they were back in the 80s.
He also wrote for television and was quite similar to Anthony Burgess in a way. He was interested in television as a form and trying to think critically and interestingly about what this form could do in comparison to the novel. So, I mean, in the late 80s or early 90s, he sort of wrote a 10-part television series on modernist writers, The Modern World, 10 Great Writers. And that, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it. He appeared on television with Anthony Burgess and Hermione Lee and George Steiner, I think. That kind of interesting, intelligent programming just kind of doesn't exist anymore. And that was on Channel 4, so, commercial channel. But they felt able to make something like that because people like Bradbury and Burgess were sort of charismatic public intellectuals. And we don't really have that as much anymore.
Yeah, I think Bradbury and Burgess were quite similar characters, and their approach to literature was very similar in many ways. Let's talk about the book more specifically. As you described already, the History Man revolves around radical ideas, depictions of liberation, whether that's political liberation or sexual liberation. It's also, in terms of its academic side of things, it's also about the disconnect between theory and practice. How was the novel received when it was first published in 1975? Were these radical politics, were these radical sexual politics often talked about in the press? And did readers and critics find it a shocking book?
It's a real novel of the zeitgeist at the time, from 1968 onwards. It's really quite difficult to imagine now because we say, students are woke and snowflakes and always protesting and stuff. But really, that's just a hangover from what life was like in universities in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was a climate that really shocked Malcolm Bradbury. There was a brief sit-in at UEA in 1971 for 10 days. The students kind of had a sit-in in the arts building because a student had been arrested for smoking marijuana in the city centre. And then he'd also been expelled from the university. And they saw it as a moral point that this was double punishment, which it was really. And so they had this sit in and they trashed Bradbury's office. And I think the office trashing scene in this book is a portrayal of that. But he was really seriously shocked by an institution which he thought was a place for the liberal play of ideas and for learning and should be distinct from these social forces. He was really quite surprised. In terms of the reception of the book, it was pretty well received when it was first published. It won the Heinemann Award from the Royal Society of Literature, and it was widely regarded as having been snubbed for the Booker. So that year, 1975, ordinarily there's a short list of 6 and then a winner is chosen. But in 1975, chaired by Angus Wilson, who was Bradbury's colleague at UEA, they only chose 2 novels on the shortlist. Ruth Prava Jabwala's Heat and Dust and Thomas Keneally's Gossip from the Forest. And it was Heat and Dust that won the award. But it was kind of perceived as having been snubbed because it was a fairly popular book. When the book really became popular was after the 1981 television series on BBC starring Anthony Sher. That's when sort of a lot of people who had previously maybe heard of the book but hadn't looked into it. That's when the book really gained popularity after the television series. It was a really good series, 4 parts, and it was partly successful, I think, firstly because Anthony Sher's just really cool in it. On the poster, he looks really cool with his sort of mustache and stuff. So I think he's just sort of quite a charismatic protagonist. But also, it's a very good adaptation. It's very faithful to the novel mostly. And in many ways, I think that's because the book's quite well suited for television adaptation. It's about surfaces and external. That's why sort of someone like Virginia Woolf is very difficult to adapt because it's all in people's heads, whereas this is all out in the open and it's all about surfaces.
Let's talk a little bit about Howard, the protagonist, the role Anthony Sher played in the TV show. Burgess describes him as a detestable character. I mean, it's not like Burgess to mince words, but that's a particularly outspoken opinion of this character. But then he sort of cuts that by saying, and this is a quote, "There will be readers capable of seeing him as a personification of all the modern virtues." Do you think this is an accurate observation? What do you think influenced Bradbury in the creation of his protagonist?
So I do disagree with Burgess, sort of humbly disagree with Burgess there, because I think the narrative voice is sufficiently ironic. He's not being presented as anything other than a villain. And I think the kind of person who would read it and actually think he's a great guy, that kind of person probably doesn't read many novels, so they probably wouldn't come across it. Perhaps I'm wrong with that. There was some speculation after the book came out of who it was based on, who Howard Kirk was based on. And if you ask various people, they'll say, "Oh, so and so from there's a Howard in this American college who's a sociologist who it's based on." Or for a time, people said that Laurie Taylor, who was quite a famous sociologist who worked at Birkbeck, Leicester, and York, people said that it was based on him because he was sort of quite similar. He was quite down with the kids, and so on. But Malcolm Bradbury and Laurie Taylor only ever met after the book was published. I think it's more likely that Howard Kirk is basically a development of the villain from his previous novel Stepping Westward. In that novel, a sort of liberal, angry young man writer called James Walker, who lives in Nottingham, is invited to become writer in residence at this American college called Benedict Arnold University, which is sort of a thinly veiled parody of Indiana University in Bloomington, where Bradbury spent a year or so, and where he's got a large archive held there as well. But in this novel, there's a character, Bernard Frolick. You don't really realise he's the villain till late on, and he's the one that's engineered James Walker's invitation to be writer in residence. And it's during the period of McCarthyism, and the college asked this writer, James Walker, to sign a loyalty oath to America. And he says, "Well, I'm not going to do it. I'm a liberal. I don't agree with it." And it causes this massive scandal, which it transpires this guy Frolick had engineered for his own advancement. And it's very similar to what Howard Kirk does in this novel, The History Man, where he invites a sort of controversial speaker and simultaneously arranges the protest against that speaker. So I think rather than being based on any particular individual, it's more of just a development of this character that he'd explored in a previous novel and sort of not exactly did it again, but sort of thought, well, actually, I can keep this going and also build in some of the intellectual fashions of the day, so sociology, radical politics.
You allude to the the big plot at the center of the novel, which is Howard organizing the protest against this right wing speaker or perceived right wing speaker. You never really find out who this person is because it's all told through Howard's dialogue, essentially. It's not quite right in saying that he invites this speaker. It's he begins a rumor to say that the speaker is coming, and
Yeah,
that in essence makes the speaker get invited in a
yeah,
way. I mean, this is a central element of the novel, and one of the elements that really strips Howard's character bare, among among many others, really. But this in particular, it shows he's not really a team player in the faculty. But what should we make of Howard's machinations more generally? What really does it tell us about not just his character, but the time in which the novel was set?
a lot of the comedy comes from the fact that he's sort of this revolutionary or sort of radical figure, and actually that's completely misplaced within the situation of a new university in the early 70s. So as he enters one of the buildings, he walks past a notice board, and one of the notices is "Start the armed struggle now?" question mark. Lunchtime session with Howard Kirk. And like this partly goes back to Bradbury's sort of, I suppose, anxiety might be putting it a bit strongly, but his real concern with what was being done to the institution of the university. But what he's doing through Howard Kirk is he's showing that the certainties that radical people who, a lot of the humor comes from the sort of way they live. So, they eat yogurt and they bake their own bread and so on. But actually saying this isn't a sort of morally superior way of living, that you can still be basically a villain whilst also having all of these progressive pretensions. And he's basically showing that, I mean, really, Howard's kind of gaming the system, right? He makes out that he's this sort of radical figure when really it's just his own advancement that he's interested in. When he becomes interested in radical politics, it's due to his interactions with his own wife, and their own sexual revolution that the pair of them have is partly an instance of him trying to get one up on his own wife. And really, as we'll come on to later, she's kind of a real victim of his in the book. So really, I read it that Howard's really a villain, and you're not, even though he's the protagonist, you're not meant to sympathize with him at all as you read it.
Even if you were to be generous and say that his politics were sincere, which I think is being very generous,
Yeah.
his politics are full of contradictions. I particularly think of the scene. So he gets students to basically be his housekeeper, a succession of young female students to be his housekeepers. And he always says to them, "Oh, let me pay you. I don't want to exploit you." And then, he sort of ends up exploiting them both sexually and in terms of the workload. They're sort of press ganged into babysitting his kids and all that sort of thing. So he is a very exploitative character, even at the same time of he's saying, "Oh, I don't want to exploit you." It's really interesting to see the development of Howard through the novel, because he's sort of remembering his time in the North, in Leeds, as a conventional academic with a monogamous relationship, very inexperienced young man who wore suits and did his work and was faithful to his wife and that sort of thing. And then you see this gradual change as he moves down to East Anglia. Almost he moves from a traditional, what I guess would be a red brick university, down to the new university, the radical university, and he changes with that move, whereas his wife doesn't necessarily change with that move. And this is sort of the origin story of Howard. You can trace it through the novel. But mentioning that, it's a novel about the relationships between women and men generally, I think. Can you speak a little bit about how women are represented in the novel and how Howard relates to them?
As we've said, it's a book about the sexual revolution and second wave feminism and the freedoms that come with things like the pill or abortion, Roe versus Wade, and so on. But the central relationship between Howard and Barbara is one of basically cruelty from Howard in his treatment of her. And she sort of tries to be cruel back, but really he treats her incredibly cruelly. I think she's kind of the key character of the book, the way that she's been thwarted and disappointed. And whenever she sort of seemingly gains some agency, it's always conditional to Howard, or she's always thwarted from any kind of real self actualization. And I think the final image of the novel is they're having one of their house parties, and Howard Kirk sort of moving around the house, enjoying being the kind of master of his domain. And then Barbara's upstairs, and she puts, quite a violent image, she puts her hand through a glass window, smashes the window, and cuts her arm. That's the ending image of the novel, right? A woman hurting herself in this way. And I think that's meant to be a kind of actualizing a metaphor of how men hurt women. And I don't think this is Bradbury being paternalistic and being like the new condition of women in the 70s after the sexual revolution is bad, but things were better in the 50s when everything was more buttoned up. He's not saying that at all. I think he's just observing that a man like Howard will be cruel to his wife regardless of the social mores of the time, and that actually for all the sort of tough talk about radical politics and feminism and so on, like Howard would describe himself as a feminist, but the way he treats his wife is just completely not conducive to her self-actualization or freedom in any kind of way. So I think really in that way it's a real critique of masculinity, and I don't think you could necessarily say, it's a feminist novel, but I think there's an important feminist point that he's making there about the way that men treat women in the 70s and in the 50s. It's not like conditions have improved majorly for women's freedom.
I agree with that, and I think Barbara, her final act of putting her arm through the window and sort of slicing her wrist, it's foreshadowed in the book in numerous ways. I think the way Bradbury hints at it is that it is a suicide attempt, because suicide is a theme running through the book.
Yeah. Early in the book, one of their friends, her boyfriend or partner, he kills himself in the garden. His suicide note is just one line: "This is silly." And Barbara's naturally quite affected by this, but Howard kind of is quite blasé about the politics of an absurdist view of life and all of this. In a way, he's only a fictional character. Like I dread to think of someone that cruel really existing. But the natural reaction to that news is Barbara's reaction, right?
Yeah, and the second incident of attempted suicide, at an earlier house party, Howard's best friend puts his hand through a window and slices his wrist. But when he does it, there's a big commotion and everybody goes and rushes to bandage him up, and he's saved by being looked after by all of these people at the party. Whereas when Barbara does it, she's alone and no one hears her. And you could read it as it was a cry for help, but just help would not come because Howard's not there. No one can hear what's happened. And the cry for help becomes more serious because no one comes to help her. So what do you make of the contrast between these two very similar events? Henry Beamish, Howard's best friend, putting his arm through the window, and Barbara later in the novel.
When it happens to him, there is that commotion. When it happens to her, there's nothing. And a novel ends, so we don't know what would have happened after, but that's quite significant because it doesn't end after Howard's come and helped her or something like that, and you get the sense that it is about the fact that this woman, despite being economically and socially attached to this guy through marriage, for all the sort of tough talk of radical politics, they are married, right? And she doesn't really have a career of her own because of him and his advancement. You get the sense that despite being sort of yoked to Howard in that way, she is completely on her own.
She goes to London and has an affair with an actor who also kind of treats her cruelly. He goes off on tour and says, "I won't see you for a while, bye." And she was trying to use this affair, or it appears that she's trying to use this affair as an escape or an emotional crutch when her marriage is going so badly. But even the man in that situation won't let her do that. So she returns to Norwich thwarted again.
There is a sense that, and this is why I don't come out all guns blazing and say this is a feminist novel, because I suppose maybe Flora Beneform is a sort of perhaps a strong female character. That's probably quite an overused phrase now that we hear people talking about. But of the women in the novel, she's probably more has a sense of her own agency and able to get or achieve what she wants.
She's quite similar to Howard in a way because she uses her position as a woman to have sex with all these men, but she's having sex with all these men so she can write her study on the male psyche and get it published and advance her career. So whether or not she's a feminist character, I don't know, but certainly she's a strong female character if Howard is a strong male character.
I don't think Bradbury's being paternalistic in his portrayal of Barbara. Look at this poor thing, how terrible her life is. But I think he is trying to make a quite genuine portrayal of the callousness of men during this time.
We've talked about how Howard treats women in the novel, but I think a really important part of his character is how he treats men as well. I mean, his best friend, Henry Beamish, Howard basically treats him with disdain all through the novel. And I think a more important aspect of his treatment of men in the novel is his male student, who is from a very small c conservative traditional idea of what university should be. He wears the university jacket and tie when he comes to the seminar. And why don't you talk a little bit about how Howard treats him and what it means for Bradbury's themes in the novel?
Yeah, so this student, George Carmody, he's kind of the one, as I said earlier, there's not really a plot to the novel, but if there is, it's not only arranging for this speaker to come and pursuing the young female lecturer, Annie Callender, it's also his kind of fight with this student. In an earlier campus novel, George Carmody would probably be the hero. He's kind of this almost like a sort of figure from an Angry Young Man novel, a bit of a swot, but sort of really interested in these ideas of culture and what have you. A typical thing of seminars at this time, I mean, I don't know what it was like when you were at university, but when I was at university, it was just you read the book and then went to the lecture and then went to the seminar. But they sort of had a bit more workload back then. So they'd ask one person to prepare a short paper that they'd then read out and critique. And Carmody does this, but Howard's just interrupting him like this is bourgeois and so on and so on. So there's this one bit where he says, wait a minute, says Howard, are you proposing to read all that? Because he's sort of got this essay prepared. And Carmody says, yes, sir. Howard says, I'm not sir. I don't want your deference. Now, what did I ask you to do? And Carmody says, you asked me to look at Mill, Marx, and Weber and make a report. And then that's what would have happened in a university at this time. But then Bradbury inverts it, and Howard said, I asked you to go away and read their works over the vacation, and then to make a spontaneous verbal statement to this class, summing up your impressions. I didn't ask you to produce a written paper and then sit here with your head hanging over it, presenting formalized and finished thoughts. What kind of group experience is that? So it's funny because Bradbury's partly parodying what students would end up doing if they'd been asked to read these things and then write a paper. They would just have not done it and then come up with something in class. But really, this is a sort of comment of what Howard's like in terms of the intellectual fashions of the time, but also compared to previous campus novels. This isn't in a novel like Lucky Jim or an Angry Young Man type novel. Carmody would have been the hero, but he's not here. He's kind of another victim of Howard, and all he's done really is just his crime, if he has one, is being interested in intellectual life. And maybe he's a bit of a nerd, but I mean that's not. He doesn't deserve Howard's treatment of him. Anyone that he's got power over Carmody, and he uses it almost really without gaining anything.
He sort of destroys Carmody, doesn't he?
Yeah, completely destroys him.
Mainly because he doesn't want his mark challenged by the second marker, which
Yeah.
is just ridiculous. You know, it's a massive abuse of power.
Yeah. If it wasn't clear already, by the time you get to that point, the reader kind of knows that he's just doing this just because he just enjoys the power of. It's not really for any kind of ideological reason. It's just because he enjoys the being able to abuse people in this way.
We've talked a lot about Howard's villainy and the interactions he has with all of the other characters in the novel. What we haven't talked about is what type of novel The History Man is. And I'm interested to find out whether you think this is a moral novel or a novel with a moral message, at least.
Yeah, indeed. I think it certainly is. Bradbury's theory of the novel, he was really interested in his academic career as a theorist of the novel, kind of trying to produce a poetics of the novel, what novels are like, what they do, and so on. And the intellectual culture that Bradbury entered in the 50s was one of all novels are moral in a way that they show you how you should live. They kind of the classic metaphor of fiction is a mirror on the world. You see yourself in it. And a key influence intellectually on all of Bradbury's generation was F.R. Leavis, and his view of the novel is really like that. So his book, The Great Tradition from 1948, is like that. Literature is a kind of moral force. Bradbury was influenced by Leavis, but all of this generation reacted to, they sort of took on some of his ideas, but reacted against him. Before Leavis, the novel wasn't seen as an important genre of literature. It was poetry was the thing. And Leavis helped to produce a culture of thinking about the novel as a serious form. And Bradbury did exactly that. He actually parodies F.R. Leavis in the novel Eating People is Wrong. There's a poet and critic called Carey Willoughby comes to visit the campus and give a paper. And he's meant to be a parody of T.S. Eliot, but there's a sort of key bit where they lay on this big dinner for him as a visitor to the campus, which is campus based on Leicester. And he doesn't eat any of the food. He just sort of opens a little thing and he takes out a few pills and takes them. And that's actually based on F.R. Leavis when he came to visit Leicester when Bradbury was there. Like he actually did that. The department had gone to great expense to put on this lavish feast, and Leavis just was like, I can't eat any of it, and just took these pills, which is quite funny. But Bradbury was really sort of keen on, I suppose a novel could have a moral, but really all novels have this sort of moral inquiry in them. And when he was chair of judges for the Booker Prize in 1981, which was won by Salman Rushdie for Midnight's Children, he says, this is a prize for serious fiction. And then he described, so this is in like the prize giving speech where he's going to announce, they're all in black tie at the prize ceremony. But he lays out his aesthetics of fiction, which he says, the serious novel is the work of a writer who's pressing at the edge of the genre, taking it as a form of inquiry. The novel is a major mode of inquiry, as serious as science, as thoughtful as philosophy, but always conscious of its own fictionality. And I think this is sort of similar to what Burgess says in the introduction to 99 Novels. Burgess says, the novel is a powerful literary form which is capable of reaching out into the world and modifying it. So there's this sense of the novel has within it this ability to kind of this mirror thing, but when you write a novel like The History Man, you're basically asking what might this be like, and how might we change the world. So it is definitely a moral novel. If it doesn't necessarily have, it doesn't have a basic moral summary of radical politics is bad. That's not what it's saying at all. It's much more complex than that. But there is a sense in all of Bradbury's fiction using it as a mode of inquiry, asking questions about the world. What might this be like if there were someone like this? And how might we treat him or react to him if we were sort of face to face with Howard Kirk? So that's a very important key point. And I think that's also why Malcolm Bradbury took so long to write all of his novels. He only wrote one every 10 years or so, basically because there's a lot of intellectual content within them, even though they're sort of comic satires.
That's a really interesting answer. Thank you. This is perhaps a simpler question, but why is it called The History Man? Howard is a sociologist. He doesn't teach history. How do you think we should interpret the title?
It's probably quite silly, but I think firstly, it's just a sound thing. That the history man sounds better than the sociology man. I think the sociology man, it's too sibilant. It just gets caught in the tongue. But it's really about, it's not sort of sociology in general that Bradbury's going after. It's this particular brand of sociology, this sort of Marxist critique, which thinks about contemporary phenomena in terms of historical forces and taking a materialist view of how things are the way they are, thinking about the contemporary situation in terms of continuity and change and revolution and sexual revolution. So even though Howard is a sociologist, it's his sort of Marxism, or his kind of warped Marxism. Marxism is meant to function as a critique of capitalism that will ultimately lead us all to live better lives. Howard's not interested in achieving a better world. He just wants to use this mode of critique, this hermeneutics of suspicion, a little Marx, a little Freud, a little social history. So it's about this way of viewing the world as the product of historical forces. Bradbury himself actually wrote a book, The Social Context of Modern English Literature, which was basically a work of sociology. So he's interested in social contexts and ways of life, like modes of production and so on. But he's not interested in this specific kind of sociology that Howard does, which is all about nefarious motives and so on. So there's a bit in the seminar when it's probably one of my favourite lines of the book. Malcolm Bradbury's describing the sociology seminar that Howard teaches, and it goes like this. It says, an apparently casual remark about one's schoolboy stamp collection or a literary reference to the metaphoric significance of colour will lead to a sudden psychic foray from a teacher who will dive down into your unconscious with three shrewd inquiries and come up clutching something in you called bourgeois materialism or racism. Howard's classes are especially famous for being punitive in this way. So it's that view of intellectual culture of always trying to catch someone out. You like that because you grew up this way. You're from, I don't know, wherever. You're from Norwich, so you must like the, blah, blah, blah. That's bourgeois Norwich or something like that. And that's just not what Bradbury thought intellectual life should be like. It should be this kind of the free play of ideas has kind of got a bit of a bad press now because it's often what quite nefarious political individuals say. They'll sort of say something distasteful and then say, well, it's just the marketplace of ideas. But maybe the 70s was a slightly more innocent time where you could make a case for a university operating in that way. But that's why it's called The History Man, is because Howard uses history to critique people and to sort of present them as ideologically nefarious or not.
What do you think Malcolm Bradbury's legacy is today? And do you think there are any writers working who are influenced by him? Can you see an influence of The History Man in particular, or Bradbury's work more generally?
I think he's just so criminally underread that I don't think he has an influence in that way. His influence really was in setting up the creative writing course with Angus Wilson in 1970 at UEA. And that's why the satire on the contemporary university isn't meant to be taken completely wholeheartedly, because creative writing was one of these subjects that was seen as kind of new. That program was massively successful. So in 1983, you may know the sort of the Granta Best of Young British Novelists, 20 novelists that were chosen. Martin Amis, Adam Mars Jones, A.N. Wilson, and so on. 4 of those 20 were associated with UEA. So Rose Tremaine and Clive Sinclair, they did BAs at UEA rather than the MA in creative writing. But Ian McEwan and Kazuo Ishiguro both won the Booker, and Ishiguro's won the Nobel Prize. They're both products of that course. And really, when the course was at its height, in its kind of heyday in the 70s and 80s, Bradbury really was keen to set it up as a way of giving slightly experimental, maybe, authors a way of writing fiction that was divorced from the marketplace. Bradbury and Angus Wilson set up that course because they were worried about the state of fiction in the late 60s, early 70s. A lot of the most exciting stuff was coming from America, or at least that's what they perceived. So you used to get a grant to study in those days. So really, doing the MA in creative writing was a way of having a room of one's own and £500 a year, right? It was kind of like that. Now the university system has completely changed, and you pay, if you're doing an MA, you pay a lot of it out of your own pocket because the loan won't cover the tuition fees at a lot of institutions. So it's all about now writing a novel. A lot of universities that offer creative writing, it's about writing a publishable novel that will meet the marketplace. You even have publishing courses or talks given at universities by publishers and literary agents. This is completely different to how Bradbury set up the course. So really, in a way, Bradbury's legacy through the course is kind of the course as it exists now, creative writing courses as they exist now in this country, are kind of completely different to Bradbury's original proposal in the 70s. So really, his legacy is more one of individual writers that he sort of worked with over that course. There's a good illustration in, I think it's in the Telegraph, of literary mafias. And one of them is the Granta, with Bill Buford in the centre and all the people that wrote for Grant around the outside. and another one is the UEA Mafia or something, and it's Malcolm Bradbury and all the writers associated with him kind of in a flow chart. And it's a bit tongue in cheek, but what it's trying to say is that basically he had a massive influence on the literary culture at the time, because not only all of these authors were going through his course and graduating, he would, in an innocent way, recommend people to publishers, or he would show their manuscript to his agent. So really, it's interesting that he was such a big influence at the time, and now he's sort of basically unknown. Unless you've got an English degree, you've probably never heard of him, which is a real shame, because such an interesting writer that deserved to be read and reread.
I would say that his criticism is really, really worth reading as well. I think he was a brilliant critic, and obviously his novels are worth reading. But I think he was a general, all-round good force for literature at a time when British literature probably needed it. So hopefully his legacy will improve in the years to come. One final question for you, Joe. We ask this to everybody. If you could add 100th book to Burgess's list of 99 novels, what would it be and why?
Well, I would firstly, with the greatest of respect to Anthony Burgess, I'd make two changes to his list.
Okay, we're all for this.
I'd remove Finnegan's Wake and replace it with Ulysses. And I know that there's that rule that it's 1939 to 1983, but the Bodley Head edition of Ulysses is 1960. So I think I can make it work. But having read Ulysses a couple of times, I'm doing a Finnegan's Wake reading group at the moment, and I just can't make head or tail of it. And I just think that Burgess was a real sort of advocate for the Wake, but I think the list is much improved by taking it out. I would also swap David Lodge's How Far Can You Go for Small World, but that's just personal. I think Small World's a more realised comic novel than How Far Can You Go. But apart from that, I'd probably, I hate to say it, and I wonder if anyone else would choose it, I would choose Martin Amis's novel Money from 1983, which sounds quite boorish and blokey, right? But I just think in terms of a comic novel, and it's quite similar to The History Man in a way, it's a funny novel and a cruel novel. I think it's a real accurate portrait of a certain kind of masculinity, but it's also just so incredibly funny. Like The History Man, I read both those novels and I'm snorting once a page, not necessarily at the events, but at the way they're sort of written. So, in Money, he says one line that I love. He goes, "Memory's a funny thing, isn't it? You don't agree? I don't agree either." And it's just this sort of playful, I suppose in a way you might call it postmodern, but it's just quite a playful way of writing a novel and an ironic way of writing a novel that we don't really seem to have anymore. The novels are written quite sincerely now and without a sort of sense of playfulness and comedy. And also, interestingly, both novels, the novelist appears. So in The History Man, Malcolm Bradbury appears briefly and he tries to sort of prevent Howard from pursuing this young lecturer, and Howard just bulldozes his way past him, which is quite a funny comment about the death of the author, I think. I think that's slightly more fun than in Money, where Martin Amis is kind of this almost unreal version of Martin Amis. Like he's always got something funny to say. So I think it's slightly funnier and more ironic the way Malcolm Bradbury does it. So yeah, unfortunately, I'd be forced to choose Money, I think, by Martin Amis.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think Martin Amis divides readers. I think, my opinion, Money is one of his better novels.
Big time.
I couldn't agree if you had picked the Rachel Papers. That's all I say.
Yeah, he's another writer, actually. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between they. After he died, after Amos died, the prevailing opinion in the media was that the novels are okay, but his criticism's better. And it's just interesting that maybe that's the view of Bradbury as well. But I think that what's interesting about writers who wrote novels but also write criticism is basically the ways in which it's all one thing. It's all one attempt to sort of provide a view of the world and a view of the novel. That's sort of lost now in increasing specialization. Novelists tend to just write novels now, and they don't write these big books of criticism. Bradbury's criticism was more academic than Amos's, but it's a similar vibe of sort of trying to work ideas out in the essay and in the novel. And really, the novel is a kind of essay in that way.
Joe, thanks for joining us on the 99 Novels podcast. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, a real pleasure to learn more about Malcolm Bradbury. So thanks for doing that for us.
Great, thanks. Absolute pleasure.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. For more information about Anthony Burgess and to find out more about the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can sign up to our free weekly newsletter, which shares writing by and about Burgess, at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com. The theme music for the 99 Novels podcast is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor, performed by No Dice Collective. You can find them online at nodicecollective.com.